When you're a musician in a recording studio, it's really important to be able to hear yourself as well as an appropriate mix of other instruments or other tracks that are either being recorded simultaneously or have been previously recorded inside of the project. But sometimes what the engineer is listening to in the mixing room is something that's completely different than you want to be listening to as a studio musician. So if you're the person in charge of the mixer, it's important to be able to set up different monitor mixes for each of the performers. And the control room inside of Cubase allows you to do just that. You can set up to 4 separate and discrete monitor mixes, usually going into headphone amplifiers for each of the performers that you have in your studio. Let's talk about making the physical connections first. On our audio interface that has 8 audio outputs, we've already connected the first pair to our monitor A speakers and our second pair to our monitor B speakers. That leaves us 4 additional outputs, or 2 stereo outputs if you look at it that way. And so we're going to make a physical connection now to a headphone amplifier, represented here by Studio 1. And you'll notice that I've put a little yellow star behind that. That's because Cubase represents studio sends with a little star icon, and I'll show you that in a moment. Now, this is a headphone amplifier. We're going to assume that the connection that you make between the audio interface and this little box is a headphone amp. So we make that connection, and then what do we plug into the little box itself? Well, we plug in a pair of headphones. So that's our first studio send. That's going to be a monitor mix for, let's say, a drummer. Now, the next thing that we're going to do is duplicate that exact same thing by taking a second headphone amplifier and plugging it into audio outputs 7 and 8, and then plugging in a pair of headphones to that. So now we have 2 different studios. That's what Cubase calls it, is a studio. It's a separate mix for each of those performers, and each performer will be wearing their own headphones. Now, how do we configure that mix for each of our performers? Well, we come back to our VST Connections window inside of Cubase. We need to add some more channels. So we've already added channels for our monitor speakers, and now what we want to do is add 2 studios. Again, the word studio is what Cubase uses as a different monitor mix for the people that you're recording. So I'm going to click on the Add Channel button, and I'm going to add a studio. And you can see that I have 4 available studios to select from. And there's that little star. We're going to see that star again in just a moment. But we're going to add 2 studio sends. So I'm going to click Add Studio, and I'm going to call this Drums. Now I'm going to zoom out here for just a moment, and if you'll look, as soon as I hit OK, watch the control room mixer over here. As soon as I click OK, bang, it's added a new volume control to our drums studio send. Now, before we can actually start to use this, we'll need to come over here and tell Cubase which ports of our audio interface we have connected our headphone amplifier to and our set of headphones, so that our drummer can plug in and hear their own separate monitor mix. So under the audio device, I'm going to go to Not Connected and choose My Audio Interface, and then I'm going to choose the 5th and 6th outputs. Again, if we refer back to our little diagram here, you can see that the 5th and 6th output are going into the first headphone amplifier, and then the headphones are plugged into that. So when I come back to Cubase, I want to make sure that our first studio send is set up on analog output number 5 and analog output number 6. Now, here's something that's really critical to understand before we can start using the control room mixer, and that is latency. How to control how much latency there's going to be, or that tiny bit of delay between when your performer plays their instrument and when they hear it coming through their headphones. That's all controlled under the Devices pull-down menu, and I'm going to go to Device Setup. And then, where it says VST Audio System on the left-hand side of your screen, you're going to go one level underneath that. For example, mine says Yamaha Steinberg FW, but yours will probably say something different. So you click on whatever shows up under VST Audio System, and then there's a Control Panel button. Now this is really important. Click on Control Panel, and the buffer size, that's the delay between when your performer plays their instrument and when they hear the sound coming out of their headphones. You'll want to set this buffer size as low as possible before you run out of processing power. And you can tell when you run out of processing power because you'll get some pops and clicks in your audio, and that means that you'll have to raise the buffer size. Right now I have my buffer size set to 128. That's an effective output latency of about 3.6 milliseconds. If you can set yours lower than that, like 64 or even 32, go ahead and do that. But a safe setting is usually around 128. But every audio interface is going to be different, so you're going to have to adjust the buffer size and see which one works the best to get the lowest amount of latency for your performers without overdriving the limits of your computer. And then the other important thing that we're going to have to do is turn off direct monitoring. If you're using direct monitoring, you have to turn it off because the control room requires that you don't use direct monitoring. Unless you're using a Steinberg MR series audio interface, then you can leave direct monitoring on. And that's one of the distinct advantages of using the Steinberg MR interface, is that there is no latency when you're using a control room and an MR interface with Cubase. So for my purposes, I'm going to leave direct monitoring on because that's the interface that I'm using. But if you're not using a Steinberg MR audio interface, you're going to need to turn direct monitoring off. So once that's set, go ahead and click on OK. Now, how do we get the sound from the mixer into our drummer's headphone mix? Well, first, let's go ahead and save this as a preset because I'm going to load a project to show you how this works. Right next to the presets pull-down menu is the Store preset button. I'm going to click on that, and I'm going to call this MLTH Home Studio. Let's just call it Home CR for Home Control Room. Now I'm going to load a project, and let's go ahead and use this drum miking setup that I have. So I've got several pre-recorded tracks, including 7 tracks of drums and 1 track of bass. And what I want to do is set up separate monitor mixes for the drummer. But before I can do that, I'm going to need to go to the Devices pull-down menu and go into my VST connections and make sure that the connections that I have for my studio are retained inside of this project. If it's not set up the way that you want it set up, go ahead and load the preset that we saved. Now all of those connections are made automatically. So my MSP speakers are on my first pair of analog outputs, my HS speakers are on my second studio outs, and then my drums are on output number 5 and 6, which is plugged into the headphone amplifier, and that's the first studio. And that all relates back to the control room mixer. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to the Cubase mixer itself by going to the Devices pull-down menu and selecting Mixer, or by typing F3 on my computer keyboard. Now, I'm going to take my transport control, which is covering up part of the mixer, and I'm going to remove it by typing F2 on my keyboard, or you can go under the Transport pull-down menu and select Transport Panel. That will restore the Transport Panel, or it will remove it if you don't want to see it. Now, this mixer that you're looking at right now is in an extended view. Normally, you might just see a small version of the mixer like this, but to use the control room, we're going to have to see that upper level of controls, or the first extended view. So I'm going to click this little button, and it's going to open up that upper level of the mixer. Now, on the left-hand side of the screen, you'll notice that there's that little yellow star. That's the Studio Sends button. I'm going to click on that, and then I'm looking at all of the Studio Sends. Now, I only have one defined right now, so I can only power up one of those sends, and that's normal because I only have one studio assigned in my control room. But what this allows me to do is to activate all of the drum tracks and the bass track too, and control how much signal from each track is going to be going to my first headphone mix, or studio number 1. So I'm going to just turn these up a little ways, and a shortcut is to hold down your command button and then click on the little fader, and that'll get everything right to 0 dB. Then I'm going to do the same thing to the bass track. Now, what I'm actually doing here is I'm controlling how much signal from each of these tracks is going to the headphone mix. So, if I come to the control room mixer and I press play on my project, I'm going to turn down my control room. This is how much signal is coming from this first studio send. So this is what the drummer is hearing if the drummer has his headphones on right now. So if he's saying, geez, my level is really loud, if he can't reach down and hit his volume control on his headphone amp, you can control the volume of his mix right here in the control room mixer. And then if he said, gosh, I'm hearing way too much bass guitar, you could come to the control room mixer and turn down the amount of bass guitar that's going into his headphones. And if he's getting too many cymbals, or if he's getting not enough toms, you can customize his mix so that he listens to exactly how much of each drum he wants to hear in his headphones during the recording. Now, if we refer back to our little diagram here, we originally had 2 studio setups assigned, and one is going to be for the drummer, and the studio 2 is going to be for the bass player. So now let me show you how to configure the bass player's monitor mixer in the next video.